Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. How do you actualize a molecular revolution? How do you create a revolutionary assemblage of minor voices? Today on the show, we are joined by Gerald Raunig, who has authored several books for semiotext, including 1,000 Machines, Factories of Knowledge, Industries of Creativity, Art and Revolution, Transversal Activism in the Long 20th Century, and Dividuum. Today, Gerald joins us to talk about his most recent work with the imprint Minor Compositions, a work entitled Dissemblage. Dissemblage unfolds a wild abundance of material of unruliness, from the multilingual translation machines of Al-Andalus to the queer mysticism of the High Middle Ages, from the small voices of the falsetto in 20th century jazz and soul to today's disjointures and subjunctures against the smooth city and machinic capitalism. Gerald, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Craig, and also Adam and Will.
Could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work before we begin discussing dissemblage?
Well, tricky. As you might know from reading some of my books, I'm quite critical about the individuality as a figure, especially when it comes to authorship. And I would say to ask an author who writes about individual authorship to introduce himself is pretty violent. But what I could do is kind of situate myself where I'm sitting here. I'm sitting in Lagunitas, which is a barrio, a quarter, a neighborhood in Malaga, in the south of Spain. And what we do here, and we is quite a broad assemblage of people, is try to develop a certain form of social machine, which is not just the connection of individuals, but a kind of assemblage of different, let's say, persons, but also non-human actors, from animals to things and whatever. This is not a commune, but rather a try to find other forms of sociality in what I call, together with others again, Machinic capitalism. So I think we will not get rid so easily of our names, but still we should try to disjoin the author names as much as we can. So excuse me if I don't go into my biography in this case, but let's dive into the content of the book immediately.
Sure. Well, I think you'll find sympathetic comrades in that. I think our work on Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault, we're very interested in this idea of depersonalization. And we are collectively writing on a book together that does not have our names. The title of your book is Dissemblage, which is not only appears to be an act, but a concept of creation, but it's also a way you attempt in this book to actualize this concept of dissemblage through the way that it is written, or should I say, the voice of the book attempts to do so. What is dissemblage? And maybe a good place to start is to talk a little bit about what an assemblage is. A lot of the followers of our podcast have read a little bit of Deleuze and Guattari, but what in your own words is an assemblage? And then how do we differentiate that from dissemblage?
Maybe it's good to try to go deeper into this question with the question of with tackling the aspect of of a concept as an assemblage. You know that even in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, you have this idea that a concept consists of components, and that is, maybe we can connect it with the aspect that concept, of course, also doesn't come out of nowhere. It is not the work of an individual genius or even God, it is interesting to look at the surround of a concept, which is also another aspect of the assemblage. It's not only its parts, but it's also its greater surround, which also connects to what Stephen O'Herney and Fred Moten were repeatedly saying when they were asked about their concept of the undercommon. They were repeatedly evading the answer and saying it's rather interesting to talk about the undercommons of the concept than about the concept of the undercommons. So the surround and the undercommons of the concept of assemblage is also an interesting aspect, which is firstly, when we are talking about the realm of Deleuze and Guattari, it's related to the French term agencement. So this is the first hint, maybe, where we could look when it comes to assemblage. For me, in my book, it's like a development out of 4 chapters that in German, in the German original, are go by the names of Fuge, Unfuge, Umfuge, and Ungefüge. So in the last chapter, we have this main concept of Ungefüge, which is translated as dissemblage. One thing is, I should translate the chapters into English. First chapter is called joint. Second one, disjointure. Third one, subjuncture. And fourth, there is a skip in terms dissemblage. So it in the first 3 concepts, it's very much about the question of joint, which comes from the Latin terms of jugum, and which means, like, let's say, link together, connect. But my interest was always in the aspect that the joint is both the connection and the rupture. That's also the way the book begins. So the first chapters are related to these terms of the joint, whereas the last one we could not translate as in this flow of aspects of Fuge, which is joint, where in German you have the term Ungefüge, because it's not possible to translate it, to translate exactly again the components of this concept, because the components of the concept in German are at least 2. One is the Deleuze-Guattarian idea of agencement, which is not very accurately translated as assemblage, but maybe it's the best way to do it. But the other conceptual component of Ungefüge has to do with disobedience, unruliness. That's the term in German, gefügig or ungefügig. Gefügig means obedient, and I like the term unruly also in English, because it's not so much subject related as obedience, but nevertheless, it's these aspects of obedience and disobedience and unruliness are not possibly translated into the English one, but nevertheless, and there you can see these rampant flows of translation and of the conceptual flows. With the English translation dissemblage, which is on the superficial level, just a negation of assemblage, there also comes with it another important component, which is there but not visible in the German, which is connected to resembling and unresembling, then in the negation of resembling. You hear it in the term dissemblage or assemblage. Maybe it's got I have to ask you, maybe it's got forgotten if you use the term assemblage, that there is this connotation of resembling also there. But anyway, as you might know from my book Dividuum, resemblance or resembling, which is connected to similarity, is a very important component of dividuality. So I laid out a lot of stuff here, but the main thing I wanted to say is that this term and its conceptual components, dissemblage, is maybe more than a negation of assemblage, and it's a neologism, yes, but a neologism in the sense that there is a lot of surround and social machine connected to it. One last sentence, because I should not forget it. While researching on the English term of dissemblage, I came across the term dissemblage, which means that it's not really a neologism, because there is a queer or an expert or an author in queer theater studies who used this term more or less in the same timing when I began to use the term Ungefüge. It's Laszlo Perlman. And it's maybe interesting that here already the queer studies background comes up, which is quite important to me for both of the books, Dividuum and Dissemblage.
It's very interesting because at a glance, when I first saw the title of the book, dissemble in English means to conceal or to hide or lie about. And it made me think of the idea of the powers of the false from Deleuze and Guattari. And I think there might be an interesting connection there that could be developed. But I was hoping to talk about one more thing before we move on. I think there's a lot of prep work to do conceptually to understand what's happening in your book. One of the dominant concepts that you tend to work with across all of your books is this concept of dividuality, which we see prominently in Deleuze's postscripts on societies of control. And I would say in some ways, as a writer, you have probably done the most to develop that concept and do interesting things with it. But in your own words, what do you think is dividuality, and in what ways do you attempt to use this? And maybe how does that concept function with the work that you do in Malaga?
Let's start with the genealogy of the concept. You mentioned the postscript on the societies of control by Deleuze, but there is already earlier traces of dividuality in A Thousand Plateaus,
Sure.
which is the wonderful chapter on the refrain. Is it the refrain?
Refrain, yes.
Yeah, refrain. And there, Deleuze and Guattari, in around the late 70s, the book came out in 1980, developed dividuality on the basic of their studies concerning sound and music. Not gonna go into this, but it's interesting to clarify that it's there in the late 70s and around 1980. That's the same time where the great feminist anthropologist Marilyn Strathern worked in Melanesia in the 70s, early 70s already. Melanesia on her development of, let's say, the individual perspective on personhood. She was researching with Melanesian peoples who more or less lived in what anthropology calls gift economy. But it's a very specific kind of gift economy. And with her feminist position, Marilyn Strathern was not romanticizing that at all, to be clear. But nevertheless, to develop a second perspective on personhood, which is not individual but dividual, was also kind of an interesting new development in the 70s and 80s. I think her book, The Gender of the Gift, appeared in the late 80s, but she was working on it in the 70s and 80s. This just to say that it was around in the 70s and 80s, and for me, it's again around these days, more or less. But it's an old concept. In Dividuum, I was trying to really properly research the ancient genealogies of it, starting with certain Latin, what is it, dramatists, people who write drama, theater playwrights, where the term dividuum comes as a rather weak term, not a real concept, comes up in the context of sexual and gender violence. That's the first moment where dividuality comes up. Then a lot of other stuff, Cicero and other philosophers, but still not a strong term. It becomes a strong concept with Gilbert de Poitiers in the 12th century medieval scholastic bishop. Maybe we can return to him at some point. But in the writings of Gilbert, you can find a very clear concept of dividual, which is even already also going beyond the dichotomy of individual and community, or being just a negation of individuality. That's something that becomes very important today, also when we think about dividuality, that it's not just the negative of individuality. Of course, one could already say that logically, dividuum comes before individuum or individuality. Clearly, in the logical perspective, but of course, then you have this great how to say, a Siegeszug, triumphal progress of the term and the ideology of the individual, very much intertwined with the beginnings of capitalism, and also ideas of individual freedom and so on. And then individuality gets forgotten for many centuries, until more or less forgotten, until Nietzsche puts it up in the 19th century, but also rather marginally in an aphorism. And then again, as I said, in the 70s of the last century, you have a strong, a certain condensation of the conceptual development. For me, I think it's today, how to say it, not only a concept that is that explains certain realities, but it is reality itself. And maybe to clarify, it's also me in a way, in the same way like Marilyn Strathern. I'm not romantic about the term. It's perfectly ambivalent. You have dangers and lines of light inside of the concept.
And the one thing that, and maybe this will be the last thing that I say about Dividuum, and I'd like to open it up for others to ask questions and make comments, is one of the ways that I think you successfully use the work of Nietzsche to describe the dynamics of debt and community, and this idea of community, the Latinate root being munus, meaning minus or debt, and how the formation of a community is often predicated on the kind of sacrifice or self-separation that's involved to create an individual. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit. How do you see the function of Nietzsche's work with respect to the concept of the individual? I mean, clearly this appears in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, Bataille to a certain extent too. But what is it that you're trying to do there in Dividuum with Nietzsche?
Yes, it's of course, again, a Latin concept, munus, which is in the Latin history, the Roman history of the term, related to taxes that you have to pay. It's not just a gift, like many authors put the weight on this aspect. No, it's a tax you have to pay. And when I say have to pay, you hear already this slight moral undertone, which is connected to what you were hinting at, the question of debt, which is in German, by the way, also very connected to the term for guilt, Schuld and Schulden. Mm-hmm. So you have this moral aspect of the debt as guilt, also involved in munus already. And well, I mean, this is important also if we come to questions of communism even. So that this is the huge bow that we could take here. But I think the main importance concerning munus is, I think, that certain authors, like the Italian strand of Roberto Esposito or Agamben even, and also the French post-structural strand, trying to expand the term community in very interesting books, like Nancy and Blanchot, for instance, coming also from Bataille. They don't get the aspect that munus is a minus. This is like a joke in a way that I share with Isabelle Loray. It's just a wordplay. It's not really that the case that munus means minus, but it's always the minus in the sense that you have to give something away, morally, but also maybe economically as a tax. So for becoming part of a community, you have to give something away. And that's, for me, also with a certain Deleuze-Guattarian background, totally wrong to start coming together, assembling or living together with this basis of a minus. What was the question?
Okay. Well, I'm very interested in what you're saying here, and if you could just indulge another question on that, and I'll try to bring us back to it. So, how do you, maybe through the lens of Deleuze and Guattari, then see the formation of community? Because a big question right now in a lot of leftist online spaces and in traditional spaces and so forth is what is grasping for this new meaning of communism. And so, given what you said, that the sort of Latinate root of communism involves this debt, this risk, or this sacrifice. But clearly for Deleuze and Guattari, they want to either elide that, or they want to bypass that in some way, or in the very sort of Nietzschean sense, get beyond the normative and the normal structures that push us towards debt and that create subjects and force us to cut ourselves off from certain intensities and form ourselves in a certain way, so that forms of debt, forms of governance register upon us as subjects in certain ways that allow us to reconstitute capitalist society and so forth. So maybe we can kind of reorient here and tell us your view, and maybe say a little bit more about what Deleuze and Guattari think.
No, I have to get back. You repeated it, Nietzsche. That was the question also. Just for one moment, be clear, in the aphorism where he uses the term dividuum, he talks about the division of the self. And this is also kind of a moral aspect of what Foucault called pastoral power. This kind of process of, in modern words, government and self-government, where the aspect of self-government in our times becomes more and more important, or even important. I don't know. One sometimes thinks we don't need any priest anymore, any governor, because we're used to govern ourselves. And I think that the term that Nietzsche uses next to Dividuum is the term self-division. And it's two aspects. It's first like producing the self as a self-governing self, with all the moral and religious aspects of governing yourself. And Foucault is perfect in explaining that in different periods of time. And I think Foucault didn't even experience what we experience today, all these kind of techno forms of self-division and self-government. But I think these two aspects of uh, producing the self and then governing the self lead me again to the demand that we should try to develop and practice forms of disjoining. And in a way, of course, Deleuze and Guattari also were quite far with explaining these forms of self-government. For instance, Deleuze and his Foucault already. But still, what happens now with certain forms of social media and also other technopolitical stuff, I think it has gone much further than even the prophetic positions of Deleuze and Guattari, especially Guattari in this case, were able to explain.
So I really appreciate the inclusion of pastoral power, and I actually really deeply appreciate the inclusion of Marguerite Porete in the discussion on authorship that you sort of alluded to in your evasion of our desire to force you to give an account of yourself, right? So I just wanted to necessarily ask you about the way in which the author function works in the time of the Dividual. You know, the author function being that which tethers the creative work to an author as the individual from whom it produces and to whom one can say it is guilty of, right? Or is guilty of producing it. So, you know, you provide this example of Marguerite Porete, who, in the context of pastoral power, is really interesting, right? Because Porete is passingly mentioned by Foucault in Security, Territory, and Population, which is the lecture series where pastoral power gets its first full articulation in Foucault's work. So I'm, and Porete famously remained silent when the Inquisitor put her and another figure on trial who would eventually would eventually provide sufficient enough evidence for her burning at the stake. But she remained silent throughout the course of her, I guess you could call it trial. So I'm wondering, in the period of the Dividual, in the throat of the control society, right? Where does where does the author function maintain itself as we approach a sort of post-disciplinary control society, something closer to something like that city that Guattari gives an articulation of? Because yeah, the unified individual seems to be something that maintains itself in the function of the author, right? At least as a sort of figure that allows it to step in and say, The Coming Community was written by Giorgio Agamben, right? Or so on and so forth. So, do you see is it important for us to change the way we talk about the author function when we talk about effacing these systems that necessitate policing, whether it be the individual, as we enter into a place where the individual is partitioned in a very particular sort of juridical way, right? It's still maintained in the author, it's still maintained in the juridical subject. But when we talk about the smooth functionality of the control society, it seems like the management of the individuality of data, of movement, seems to be the primary mode of control, at least in contemporary technological discussions. Where do you see the function of the author manifesting itself in all of these other discursive regimes, whether it be something as silly as Twitter or as important as the propaganda of the deed, right? and how can we approach the author function in order to destabilize it and to leave the murmur that asks the question, what does it matter who is speaking, right? So that, I think, between your treatment in Dividuum and your work on Porete, who I think is a major figure in this book, I'm left with sort of a really interesting question about the way in which you approach the author function.
Thanks very much. The connection of the works and life of Marguerite Porete and the bow until now, like what is it? 700 years, more than 700 years. Is quite an interesting one. And you're right, Marguerite Porete is one of the bigger figures in this in Dissemblage. But again, it's maybe more than Marguerite Porete. By the way, when it's good that you mentioned Foucault's lecture, because that's exactly the point where my interest started. Because I normally I like Foucault very much for his in-depth archive research, but in this lecture I had the feeling that it's like a bit superficial. He mentions a lot of disobedient heretic groups. And one of them was the Beguines, and the Beguines were already in the 2000s. I was writing about them because on the occasion of a conference that we organized with the name of the Art of Critique, and there I just tried to start my research on the Beguines and didn't come across strongly across Marguerite Porete, but then for Dissemblage, it was the time to really go into into her own writing mainly. I'm not so much interested in the kind of historical and biographical details, though they are super interesting there. But I was reading her book, the Miroir, as a great philosophical book, and it's really, again, another example for the masculinism of philosophy, that this work has not been researched as as Marguerite Porete's work until the mid of the 20th century. Of course, there were, and there were in the center of your question too. There were also there was the violence of censorship of the Catholic Church there, which was responsible for this invisibility of Marguerite Porete. She not only suffered as maybe the first person ever being burned for her writing, but she also had to write in an anonymous way, of course, because otherwise it would have been very dangerous for her. I mean, it was the time before the so-called witch hunts. That's also interesting, but it was quite a dangerous the time of trials against bishops and rather prominent male persons. So even for a woman, it was much more dangerous. And then the second thing, she when she was kind of identified with as a writer of her book, she died for it. As you said, she didn't talk about anything. She didn't answer. That's an interesting figure also, as you said. But then afterwards, her book was translated in the first century after her death in, I think, 5 languages or so, and spread all over Europe. So in a way, it was against the censorship of the the church, it became quite important. Why was it? I think here for the first time, I think the connection between text machine and social machine was very strong. Marguerite was not alone. She was writing with the fellowship of her fellow beguines, who were partially sedentary beguines at certain places in certain cities, but also nomad beguines moving from city to city, and also, at least in my, how to say, half fictional account on it, she was also, or she, not she, but the text machine she was involved in was the text machine connected to the social machine, which was a kind of revolutionary danger to the church, which called themselves brothers and sisters of the free spirit. There is not so much trace in the archives about that, because of course also there the Inquisition did a great work. There is no trace positively about this movement and the life of Marguerite Porete and her sisters and brothers. But you can read out of the protocols of the Inquisition, like ex negativo, you can read some aspects of that. Now I could go on for very long, especially one has to say about the quality of this philosophical and theological text of Marguerite, which is really something which only Luisa Muraro, the Italian feminist, was diving into it in a broader way in the I think in the 80s or 90s, but it's still kind of not very well discussed in philosophical circles. But to come to your broader question concerning the kind of connection of these questions to the question of authorship in machinic capitalism, I think you're very right in hinting to a certain problem that we should not maybe become too much stuck into the question of individual authorship and how to prevent the appropriation of it by creative industries, let's say, because there might be even a bigger problem in dividual authorships, now in a negative sense, not in the wonderful experiment that obviously also you are involved in concerning collective writing, but rather in something that kind of sweeps away even the positive aspects of individual authorship. And when I'm saying that, I'm not talking about copyright or whatever, which is really kind of, even in the more progressive versions of Creative Commons, you still have the leftovers of this quite, well, clearly capitalist function. But I'm talking about the shadow sides of Dividuality. Now, still, there is the positive side of kind of transversal intellect that is always in the background of our writing, and that should be reproduced all of the time, or reproduced, I don't know, newly created every time that we write. But yeah, the negative aspects of Dividuality come into play also. And there, my favorite example, which is so obvious, is the example of big data. That is like it's very obvious that all of the actors who are interested in big data are not so much interested in individual data. That's still the how to say, the preoccupation of the people that secret services are behind them as individuals or whatever. No, secret service are behind them, but not as individuals, not so more anymore, not so much anymore. But they are interested in piling up huge piles of accumulations of data to then traverse these piles of data in a individual way. So they're not interested in identifying certain individuals, but rather dangers that are rather individual and are also to be detected by individually traversing the data accumulations.
I just want to follow up because I think this is this question of risk is really important when it came to Porete. I think part of the reason why it was so important to tether the mirror to Porete is precisely because of what you talk about as it pertains to pastoral power and counterconduct, which is another concept that sort of lurks in the footnotes of Dissemblage. And I want to just read one passage from the mirror real quick for listeners, which will just be: love invokes the voice of reason, which is one of the figures in this dialogical text. It's a remarkable book. And love invokes this voice saying, reason responds to love saying, my judgment and all my counsel is the best that I know how to counsel. That one desire contempt, poverty, and all manner of tribulations, and masses and sermons and fasts and prayers. That one have fear of all kinds of love, whatever that might be, for all the perils which can be there, and that one desire above all paradise, and that one have fear of hell, that one refuse all manner of honors and temporal things, and all comforts in obstructing nature, in what she asks, except those things without which the soul could not live, as in the exemplar of suffering and passion of our Lord Jesus Christ. So what ends up, this is one of the passages that ends up being selected along with a few others, particularly focusing not on content, right? Not on the canonic gesture of the 7 stages of annihilation, but specifically on the function of the church. And what I find really fascinating here is that when Foucault singles out Porete and the Beguines, it's not just, and you point this out too in the book, it's not just an anti-institutional positionality that they have, even though that's fundamental, right? It's part of the reason why these passages are selected and read out by the Inquisitor. But there's also an element of a particular relation to the processes of subjectivation, what we would call the hermeneutics of the subject, right? That are short-circuited by this kind of particular approach to kenosis that implicates the institution, but only at the level of the subject, not at the level necessarily of just what we would call like the institutional, right? Or the superstructural. And I think because I think one thing that both Dividuum, but I think more so Dissemblage, gets to is the necessity for a particular kind of ethics in the face of these mechanisms of control. And I think what really ends up coming to the forefront of the anti-pastoral counterconduct of Marguerite Porete is that it necessitates a particular ethics that undoes, or that from the get-go, or is always already, whatever you want to call it, in a sort of disentangling relation to pastoral power. And this was in Dividuum, but your commentary on the confessional in Dividuum, I think, is deeply related to the way in which you engage with anti-pastoral counterconduct here. And I wonder, maybe I'm thinking too far ahead or reading too much into, one or two passages in these two books. But does this necessitate for us a particular kind of ethical approach? And, should we look to these non-heteronormative moments of community, right? Even when Marguerite Porete is breaking with the Beguine, right, at the end of The Mirror of Simple Souls, when she's like, what what will my sisters say of this text? She only seems to be breaking with them in as much as she wants to perpetually put on trial any of these hierarchizing relations to practice, to religious practice. She maintains a relationship to the community of the Beguine, which I find really interesting. So is there a kind of ethical component to the Dividual that relates to what I think is your analysis of counterconduct?
Yes, of course. Thanks for the whole comment. Also bringing together Dividuum and Dissemblage. It's quite interesting to hear that. And beyond any narcissism. I think one thing is that the kind of relationship between the text machine writing the mirror and the institution of the Catholic Church is that it not, as you said, not purely anti-institutional. She talks about the big church and the minor and the major church, if you want, which is confusing to us because we're having a positive idea of minority. But here, the minor church is just mocking about the existing institutions of the Catholic Church, which means that this minor church is not really connected to any reality. But the major church is, in a way, the molecular dispersed masses that have a certain relationship to, let's say, God. But I'm not sure if the brothers and sisters of the Free Spirit were so much interested in God. But anyway, there is, I think, it starts with this mocking relationship, that there is still an interest in the church, even in a weird, subverted way. And that's something that I would also propose for today's institutional critique. In some of, I think in Factories of Knowledge, I was just, how to say, developing the term of transversal intellect, which is the further development of the Marxian term general intellect, used very much by the autonomia and so on. And I think this term also helps us to understand what the autonomia meant with exodus. For me, it's always a double exodus. There is no the pathetic idea of being outside the institution is really a bit ridiculous. I'm also on the political level, I think there I would say the problematic leftist position would be an insurrectionist, putting themselves totally outside of any institution. I think that's not possible. I think the one thing that is possible is, as put up with this concept of double exodus, is at the same time trying to struggle inside of the institution, whatever institution it is. Maybe it's educational institution, but could be any institution. Struggle inside of the institution, either when it's possible, even about the structures of the institutions, or rather, there I come to your question, rather on an ethical level. And there we're maybe again with Stefano Harni's and Fred Moulton's work about the undercommons, that it's not about only the structural aspects of the institution, but also the transversal connections between, let's say, the barbershop in the campus, that's their example, the security personnel, the people working in the service everywhere, and not only concentrating on the two strong figures or three strong figures in the university, the teacher, the student, and maybe the management, and as third position. And that's really, these questions are ethical questions in the old sense of the word. And the other part of the double exodus would be the kind of extra institutional aspect, where it's about founding new institutions, experimenting with other forms of institutions, be they small or bigger, whatever.
Yes, I mean, I'm going to take a little bit of a way back and forth throughout things said before to get to it, but we'll get there. So, I mean, first, I just want to say how much I really enjoyed this particular distinction between kind of a dividual multiplicity versus a dissembled multiplicity, particularly when it comes to the idea of tech, because it really hits on the mark that we are divided constantly in terms of becoming, as you call it, a data bank into various different accounts. We have various different passwords. You have to have an app for this and app for that, and each one comes with a different account. You can have sort of centralized accounts, but this is the real essence of pitting the assemblage against the dissem, because the joint is what joins things together into an assemblage, and yet the joint presupposes that which it joins together, and in joining them, it severs part of them off, and it's very much tied to the idea of going to Latin, of course, going towards Porete with the religio of religion, the thing that binds. And the idea is from Porete, of course, or even just to go to the Beguines, who are the sort of maybe the more insurrectionary people here, who take kind of an almost quasi-monastic lifestyle without the giving up, without the minus is the munus of heading into the nunnery or the monastery. And I think the focus on Porete is incredibly helpful, particularly because this idea of the Mirror of Simple Souls is a book which has such a plurality of characters. It's hard not to describe it other than as a flurry of personae, but no single person. And of course, at the end, we have the annihilation of the soul, the singularity point, which we could all collide into, but is nonetheless left out there. And I guess to move on to the real essence of my question, I guess, is to think about the dissemblage versus the dividual, and the idea that there is a multiplicity which undergirds all joining. How does that fit into the practices of knowledge production? Because a lot of your book focuses on the knowledge production in Al-Andalus, when Aristotle was being translated into Arabic. You have like Maimonides, Ibn Rashid, and this eventual taking over of Al-Andalus in the Reconquista by the Latin world, and the overall sort of proliferation of Aristotle and these works into Latin, for which it becomes inscribed in the tools of the European Empire, building up all the way into the Enlightenment and Kant. And Kant, in a way, is the great joiner of dissemblages into divided or mannigfaltige, manifold objects, where objects are joined together. What is exactly lost in joining together is the multiplicity that undergirds them, insofar as we project these categories which cut through the multiplicity of sense and relegate it into various aspects of an object, the manifold of the object, which all has to be united under transcendental apperception and the I think. And of course, this is not an epistemological project purely, it's also fundamentally an ethical one, which feeds into his question, what is enlightenment? But this is a firmly assembled, a firmly joined enlightenment, which has to ignore in ways the kind of, to put it in Marxian terms, the primitive or primary accumulation which happens in the events of the Reconquista upon Al-Andalus and the various exchanges of knowledges there. So if we was going to, say, pose a distinction between a minor enlightenment and a major enlightenment, one European in the major sense, one non-European in the sense that Europe has to extract or forcibly exploit, colonize the knowledge out of this, how would you talk about the question of the Enlightenment in these terms, perspective of, say, minor dissemblage versus major dividuality?
How to start? Maybe with a small critique of the dichotomy of minor and major. One of the podcasts that I listened to 3 or 4 of yours, was the one with Nick Thorburn, and I liked it very much, I have to say.
Thank you.
Nick is a great author, but his explanations on minority and minor literature and the minor made it for me again clear that I would not put up this dichotomy, and also with I mean, with the background of, for instance, the Kafka book of Deleuze and Guattari, I would say there are only minorities. And at least on the level of becoming. On the level of violence, of course, we could talk about these figures of whatever accumulation of dominant positions, white, male, etc., heteronormative, etc., etc. But on the level of becomings, I think there is no majority. There is only minorities, endless minorities. But that's a terminological question. I wanted to say also something about this idea of the Reconquista as primitive accumulation. I think if you have an idea of primitive accumulation as starting with Rosa Luxemburg and then going on with the feminist in Bielefeld, up to Silvia Federici as a in a way post-operaist or post-autonomist author. Their idea of primitive accumulation, of course, is that it's an ongoing process. That is not one moment before capitalism. This idea of primitive accumulation, I really agree very much. And then this has a certain, how to say, effect. One is to put up an alternative canon to this kind of major historiography, which says that, of course, the Reconquista is the reason for everything which comes after it. One could say with the famous post or operaist slogan that the struggles are ontologically primary. It's exactly the struggles of the brothers and sisters of the free spirit, the Beguines and the many other heretics that Foucault is mentioning, that there the thing starts. So this kind of primitive accumulation that the Reconquista could be is, in this sense, a reaction to these dangerous, monstrous struggles that are on the way to become a molecular revolution, or even a becoming molecular revolution. So, and maybe the last thing on this level could be to again talk about the philosophy of history here, and with the help of the great Walter Benjamin, remember what he writes in the second thesis, and it makes the things more complicated, I would say. It's not only about writing alternative canons, but it's also understanding that there are minor struggles, other generations, as Benjamin writes, that are expecting us, or that have been expecting us. And with this expectation, there is also a bit of a demand coming up. Fulfilling the promises, fulfilling is maybe too much, but actualizing the discourses and the struggles of their times in our situations, of course, in our times. But I think this idea of Benjamin, that there is a certain relation, a kind of, this is my interpretation also of the Hamlet talk, the time is out of joint. The time is jointed and is out of joint. Of course, this relation to former minor struggles is both in connection, but also out of joint. And we have to kind of care for these relationships. And this is, by the way, will also an ethical relationship for me. It's like even an ethical relationship towards or with people and maybe even things that are gone long time. So I mean, we could also, Walter Benjamin is not the only one. I think what Donna Haraway wrote with her wonderful term "odd kin" is also to be seen on the temporal level. It's not only the odd kin that we are, I call it windy kin, by the way, that we assemble ourselves with, but also the ones in former times. As I said, the minor struggles that are expecting our actualization of their sparks.
Before we finish up, Adam or Will, did you have any loose ends that you had?
I mean, other than thank you, no. I mean, I one thing that I think is that I appreciate about the text is its transversal of history without articulating a sort of transhistoricality to these modes of resistance, which I appreciate. Right, the ability to link, say, literary works as disparate as All Incomplete and The Mirror of Simple Souls without reducing them to each other, which I think is part of the struggle in articulating these. I mean, we've already talked about whether or not we call them minor histories or something like that, right? But so I appreciate that, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Absolutely. I mean, I've to come back to this text quite a few times. I was still thinking about visibility and the risks of visibility that come of it. Of course, as you're saying, there's no non-alienated region. There's no pure territory where we can just purely establish this zone of, not to call it a zone of exception, but a zone of pure sort of outsideness, let's say. Or that's even worse term, maybe. But I mean, I keep thinking in my head, rolling around the fugue, as trying to think the fugue bars, like the jointedness being availability, but availability to who? And this is where I think the considerations of dividuality, where multiplicity isn't simply. Occasionally we get these critiques of Deleuze and Guattari by saying, oh yes, multiplicity, neoliberalism loves multiplicity, yes, but only joined, bounded multiplicity formed in the availability to it. And I just think it's just beautiful to highlight that out and demonstrate it through these various interlocking textual historical machines, because they are both the demonstration thereof and the production, and that's the exactly collapsing of that transcendental sort of subject function of the author, which Deleuze, Guattari, and even Artaud takes to so much of the task.
Yeah. So once again, Gerald, I just want to say thank you, and I'll have you know that we have read your work. We talk about it behind the scenes. It informs the practical dimension of the work that we do here and outside the podcast. And we also want to thank Stephen from Minor Compositions, who basically coordinated this this interview with you, which I don't think we would have had otherwise. So thank you very much.
There is also a wonderful sound piece on the web that you maybe could also feature on your site, where Stephen reads parts of Dissemblage with some crazy sound works by Alexander Tuchacek also. So yeah, and you write thanks to Stephen and thanks to all the three of you in a great conversation.
Great. And what I'll do is, after this recording, I will just tag that recording on. So if you're listening, you'll hear it immediately after I'm done talking.
An jeder Tür soll eine Fuge sein. An jeder Tür soll eine Fuge sein. So kommt der Wind herein, Wind herein, Wind herein. Die Türe sang nach Mitternacht vom Neuanfang. Bin aufgewacht. Lass dich nicht ein auf Seers Macht, auf was im Kommen sei. Und die Stimmen der Betroffenen schwingen sich auf, zu Zukunftsoffenem. Trunken, nüchtern, die Besoffenen, Bierdosen rollen vorbei. Weh geschwind viel Wind hinein, vergiss die Fügung in ein Eins. An jeder Tür soll eine Fuge sein, so kommt der Wind herein. Wir fragten nach Zeichen, sie wurden gesandt. Aus Geburt wurden Leichen, Hochzeiten verbrannt. Doch das Bild der Vergangenheit hat keinen Bestand. Es huscht vorbei. Ungefügige Türen im Wind, singen windige Lieder, das himmlische Kind. Die Zeit steht ein, wenn wir unruhig sind und aus der Reih. Wege schwind viel Wind hinein, vergiss die Fügung in ein Eins. An jeder Tür sollen viele Fugen sein, so kommt der Wind herein. Füg die Teile zusammen und es macht sie nicht ganz. Blas ihnen den Marsch, bleibst doch nur Ordonnanz. Alle liebenden Herzen erscheinen zum Tanz und sie ziehen vorbei. Wege schwind viel Wind hinein, vergiss die Fügung in ein Eins. An jeder Tür soll eine Fuge sein, da kommt die Liebe rein. Von der Unmund zum Ungefüge.
Sorry, we'll do it again. In humanist and medievalist discourses, the 12th and 13th centuries have long been described as the period of an early Renaissance, but also as the age of a first Enlightenment. The philosophical developments of the Arab world and their translations into Latin created a climate in Europe that allowed the sciences to flourish. And with that, the institutional development of law schools, medical schools, cathedral schools, and eventually universities. This first Enlightenment reached Europe not least through Al-Andalus, through translation assemblages in Toledo and elsewhere. But what if this first Enlightenment, the movements of the 12th and 13th centuries, and not only them, were understood not as just a precursor to the Enlightenment of the 18th century, but as an inverse Enlightenment, a turbid and troubled Enlightenment beneath the Enlightenment, before and before the Enlightenment, a subjoined, unruly, queer Enlightenment. If, alongside the great showdowns between the scholastic precursors of Enlightenment and the propagandist precursors of counter-Enlightenment, of Crusade and Holy War, a very different line came into view, the fragile Dividual line of translation in all directions, of beguinic disjointure, of mystical excess, of the return of an Enlightenment out of joint. What if Kant's inferior vanguard did not desire the emergence from self-incurred immaturity, but an exit from the self as permanent self-appropriation and self-government, Unmut as temporally and socially overflowing minority, eternal becoming minor and mutual indebtedness? Unmut means to refuse patriarchal protection, government, control, and to do so from both sides of the Mut, the manus, the sovereign paternal hand. It means to subjoin a dissemblage, a blurred multitude, a non-conformist swarm to this violence, which goes hand in hand with isolation and obedience. Such a swarm is impatiently patient, dispersed and intangible, only ever passing through. Its Unmündigkeit, writes Fred Moten, translated as minority or immaturity, is more literally unprotectedness, or perhaps what it is to be ungoverned, as what is out of hand or unhanded, as the Spiller's echo anticipates this, in having been handed, not in hand, not in good hands, ungrasped, unowned, passed around. Escaping from the father's Mund, from the slaveholder's hand, from his protection, which is dominion, and yet remaining underage, unwilling and unable to be of age, always remaining before and before the Vormund, the guardian, staying immature, unappropriated and unappropriatable, unfit for all property, satisfied with use, occupation, and inhabitation, falling and still falling, unsettleable, unsettled, not possessing even oneself, but possessed by many, by the improper ghosts, by the voice mates in Unmut. To become minor is to fall into this multiplicity, into this world of things, unprotected, without paternal protection, vulnerable, fragile, but not alone, into a world in which things do not show themselves to us, but mutual showing constitutes the world, mutual seeing, mutual knowing. Everything looks at everything, writes Clarice Lispector in The Passion According to G.H. Everything lives the other. In this desert, things know things. The other side of reification is becoming thing, transmutation, which never arrives at the being thing in reification, always continuing to transform as becoming minor, becoming similar, or becoming nothing, minor embracing with the things. And Fred Moten asks further, what is the relation of fallenness and minority? What does it mean for nothingness to have fallen into the world of things, to have fallen into a state of radical inauthenticity, insofar as our talk is idle and our relation to things is one in which we do not grasp them, as if their showing is, in the first instance, not for us, as if, instead, world was always being reconstituted as a mutual showing. Moten formulates these questions to the ghost of Immanuel Kant, who simultaneously sees and is determined not to see, the Ausgang in what is enlightenment, the general gift, the consent of the ones who are out of hand, unowned, ungrasped, fallen, falling. Majority is based on self-seclusion and on renouncing mutual giving and the dissemblage's consent. The autonomous and sovereign subject who can emancipate from the Mund by creating his own Mund power is based on the devaluation and exclusion of everything that is minor, not human, not white, not male. Against this backdrop, Fred Moten turns Kant's self-incurred minority around and around until indebtedness and immaturity can only be interpreted as mutual indebtedness, as queer, more than human bracing of dissemblages. In order not to fly off the handle, not to have his hand or head fly off in some anti- or anti-analytic transversal and retraversal of every Königsberg bridge, Kant pulls back from the general impropriety but he also gestures towards or opens onto the dark time or black time of the Enlightenment's common underground, the double edge of the fact that modern times have only ever been dark. This long temps of darkness and its black light, its open and general obscurity, is seen by everybody but the overseer in his blindness. Nina Simone's and Gilles Deleuze's imminent hell down here, Stefan and Stephanos and Stephen's noctambulism, Clarice Lispector's cockroach eclipse, all persistent turbidity of Donna Haraway's trouble, those in the dark one does not see. And if artificial illumination falls on things that have their place in the shadows, they step into a false light. The sharp eye of the Enlightenment wants to recognize, and it sees nothingness when it looks into the darkness that subjoins it. The darkness of the modern age is the subjuncture of the Enlightenment. Its joints and disjointures emerge in a queer Middle Age, and with them the dissemblage emerges. Unfugug. Fuck. Ungefuge. In Old High German, ungefugi, in Middle High German, ungevog, stands for something naughty, inopportune, awkward, cloddish. Here dissemblage is already not only ungefug, disassemblage, and disobedience, not only negation of technical and moral fitting, joining and disposability, but something positively monstrous, outrageous, hulking, explosive force of the tremendously big and the infinitely small, in mu and in nu, not formless and shapeless abyss, undivided one, but divisible, divided, folded multitude. The dissemblage is not negation of the assemblage. It is before and before assembling and joining, dividual division, multiplicity. It is always already divided and composed, fractures and bonds, gaps and seams. It is composed of different parts of things, machines, ghosts, humans, animals, and these parts can never be put together completely. They join in unwillingness, are never well joined, never whole. never complete. If the joints expand, the dissemblage can widely disperse, still brace the most distant. The dissemblage is unruly, non-conforming outwardly and inwardly. The things that constitute it need not conform, align, conjoined. Disjoined in underworlds. Unearthly, the dissemblage drifts in turbidity. There it lets itself drift, and stays with the individual trouble. How can the dissemblage evade unification, completion, totalization, becoming a folk, a closed and self-contained community, a fascistoid machine, a mob of Wutberger? There is no general antidote against the imminent capture of the dissemblage by state apparatuses, nor against its unification in the community form. And even when it comes today to forms of individual and collective disobedience, turned into open hate speech and hate campaigns, there can be no universal rules or ready-made recipes once and for all. Yet again, the three components of Gilbert's concept Dividuum, aligned against identity, substance, and individuality, can serve as conceptual machines: similarity, subsistence, dividuality. And with it the windish kin. Then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin. Then the wind comes in, and with it the then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin, and with it the then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin, then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin, then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin, then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin, then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin, then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin, then the wind comes in, and with it the then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin, then the wind comes in, and with it the then the wind comes in, then the wind, and with it the windish kin, then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin. Then the wind comes in. These conceptual machines join with minor voices and falsetto shallows, indices of a queer masculinity that does not conjoin with the impositions of fathers and brothers, renegade from sovereignty and appropriation, uncomfortable to the standard measure, to the ignorant who does not know because they are disinterested, to the empathy-less who can afford their lack of compassion, to the one-eyed who see nothing because they are incapable of recognizing, let alone differentiating the non-normalized, to the secure who are secure because they are limited to themselves, and carefree because they know no care. "Man, who is this they you talking so much about?" somebody asks the veteran, the voice of wisdom in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, who was interned in an asylum for the semi-insane. And he replies, "They? Why, the same they always mean. The white folks, authority, the gods, fate, circumstances. The force that pulls your strings until you refuse to be pulled anymore. The big man who's never there where you think he is. Never arriving at that standard measure, never becoming a real man, never becoming a great man, never becoming real big, never of age, never really white. Before and before the Vormund, the guardian, lies the Unmund of minor masculinity, a life in falsetto. In the socio-poetry of the falsetto, the minor voice withdraws from the majority that is inflicted upon it, into which it is enjoined and conjoined, into which it no longer wants to join. The minor voice is minor in the sense that it does not simply fit into the numbering logic of majority-minority, and that it defects from the paternal divine logarithmic enjoinings, disposable only to the innumerable multitude. The minor voice is not a diminished, inhabited, reduced voice. It lets itself drift, in the excess of the subjuncture of which it is a part, in the noise of the ground around, and in the songs of the things in the surround. It lets itself fall apart rather than fall down. If Unmut means refusing patriarchal protection from both sides of Mut power, then minor masculinity not only refuses to be major, but also transforms the aspect of patriarchal protection-giving, governing, controlling into something else. Queer minor masculinity immaturely cares for individual desire instead of satisfying interests and needs. Care, sweetness, softness are not character traits or gift packages, but mutual machines. Multiplicity of care relations, care in the plural. Fragile, fugitive falsetto, leaning back in becoming minor, sinking into multiplicity. Its Unmut is the disjointure that lets its voice become minor, refusing government and self-government, destroying the self, and that lets it become more in the composition of the dissemblages.
Die Stimmen nicht stützen, sich nicht in die Brust werfen. Ein Leben im Falsetto, werfen im Falsetto, im Falsetto. Die Stimme nicht stützen, das Machinic. Die Städte und kleiner Menschen sich nicht in die Brust werfen. Ein Leben im Falsetto.
When the self disjoins into nothingness, it does not dissolve into God, the divine love, the Holy Spirit, but lets itself fall into the manifold multitude, all disposable dissemblage. Selves out of joint, machinic disjoining, ever new variants of windy songs, pet tunes, favorite voices. Their whispers sometimes make no sense, no matter how closely we listen. Kindred souls do not speak one language. Hypophonal choirs, signifying music. All native language is pervaded by minor voices, many tongues, unruly winds. No blood and soil mono and homolinguality. Blown away descendants, according to Donna Haraway, when she thinks about oddkin and seed-dispersing generations. Driftykin, bracedkin, soulmates, anime, made kin by an unruly wind. Never wanting to be Slovenian, never arriving in the Slovenian. Becoming Slovenian, yes, but never wanting to have the Slovenian, never wanting to possess it, never wanting to appropriate it, to capture it. Even if one believes to possess something of it, to interpret this possession as an obsession, an occupation, a poor possession, out of joint, in the joints, lurking for the joints. Then the wind comes in, and with it the windish kin. Becoming Slovene Without a Word of Slovene. In a letter to Gershom Scholem, Walter Benjamin writes about the translation of his Berlin childhood around 1900 into French. The translator does not know a word of German. The technique with which we proceed is, as you can imagine, not of cardboard. What emerges, however, is almost consistently excellent. Becoming windish without a word of windish, but not without wind, not without wending, not without transmutation. Unruly wind, which makes the dissemblage of wends and windish become intangible, void as in the Greek anomolios, windy as that which cannot be captured. From the points of view of the linguistic standard measure, the wends stood for the unknown, not exactly identifiable vernaculars, Slavs. Analogously, until the 19th century, windish was used as a German synonym for Slavic, later for Slovene, and increasingly as subordinate, small peasant, rural, backward, in contrast to the dominant German language of the bourgeois upper class. In the 20th century, it narrowed ideologically to those willing to assimilate, the German-friendly, homeland-loyal Slovenes. This development can be described as a split of the Slovene minority into loyalty and betrayal, assimilated Windish and Yugoslavia-oriented Corinthian Slovenes. From both sides of the split, windish can pejoratively signify agile and windy in the sense of opportunistic adaptation, but can also refer to the limbo, the escape from the opposition of Slavic and Germanic, in which the windish remains in the murk, in the joints. Not a simple hybridization, not a mixed language, but a line of flight, a continuum of transformation. This is what Benjamin called the practice of translation in an early essay. This is how the best musicians spoke Slovenian or Windish or Sinti with each other, or switched without circumstance or transition between the minor languages and the dominant language. When their improvisations pushed the production of desire in the Uni Club and the Com Center, combined with the softness and care of the hippie latecomers. When jazz was not the sound of dead jellyfish, but a pulsating social machine, a desired machine that braces music and social struggles. The sounds, the rumbles, the row were audible in the 1970s in different ways. As outside of capitalism on the other side of the Lubel Pass, as possibility of a communist workers' self-management, echoed in the minor voices on this side of the Lubel and their minoritarian struggles. With this, the old meaning of windish as twisted, strange, disorderly always resonated. Windish like a leaflet in the wind, a subjectivation traversing all dichotomies, a freshening wind, a storm blowing through the joints.